Hi students! Today we're going to be giving you a brief introduction to the concept of speciation, how new species arise. First, it might be important to define what a species is. Here we see a woman and a chimpanzee communicating, dressed similarly, but they're not the same species. And other times it's even more difficult to recognize one species from another. So there has been a development of something called the biological species concept, and this is what most scientists use today. This defines a species as a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So these populations, these groups, they must be able to interbreed to be considered the same species. A woman from Siberia and a man from Jamaica can reproduce if they have the opportunity to be in the same place at the same time. All humans are of the same species. The same is true for a Great Dane and a Labrador, or a Labrador and a Poodle. That's how we got the Labradoodle. The main key in this is that the biological species concept proposes that speciation, the evolutionary process by which new species arise, involves reproductive isolation. If you take a species and you make groups of that species reproductively isolated from each other, then they will no longer be able to interbreed with each other. So let's talk a little bit more about that reproductive isolation. Basically, it includes biological factors or barriers that impede members of species from being able to have viable, fertile offspring. Here we have the famous skunk from cartoons of the 80s named Pepe Le Pew. Even though he's madly in love with Penelope the cat, the biological species concept unfortunately means that these two could never bear children. I do want to make a quick note about hybrids. They do exist. Their viability and fertility is typically diminished. So we can have two species have an offspring, but again, their viability and fertility is diminished. So we'll come back to this issue in a moment. So there are two main categories of reproductive isolation. The first involves prezygotic barriers, barriers that block fertilization from occurring successfully. So here you see an unfertilized egg, and it'll stay unfertilized for whatever reason. These kinds of barriers prevent the sperm from getting to the egg. But there are also postzygotic barriers where a sperm and an egg can come together successfully, and you can see there's cell division happening here. The zygote does form, and for some reason that doesn't lead to the fruition of fertile, viable offspring. So let's talk a bit more about those prezygotic barriers. One example of a prezygotic barrier is habitat isolation. Some species can live in the same region, but there's a specific habitat where they live that's distinct from other members of similar species. In this case, one kind of garter snake lives in the water, while the other species of garter snake lives on the land. And that just has made mating impossible. These two kinds of snakes are reproductively isolated from each other, and they've now been apart for so long that they could not come together and make viable offspring. Temporal isolation is another interesting one. Even if some species share the same habitat, they may mate at different times of the year or even the times of day, preventing mating from happening. Take, for example, these spotted skunks. Eastern spotted skunks mate in the winter, while western spotted skunks mate in the fall. This difference between the skunks makes them reproductively isolated from each other. Behavioral isolation is important because a lot of species have courtship rituals that attract only very specific mates and wouldn't be attractive to other members of other species. And finally, mechanical isolation. If mating is attempted, it would fail due to some problem with the reproductive machinery being compatible. For example, there are some snails that have their shells spiral in a particular direction, and that indicates in which direction their sexual organs face. So some snails with the right spiral can't mate with snails with the left spiral. And in this case, I show a great big dog and a little chihuahua, and we don't need to discuss it in detail, but you can tell that these two animals, even though their sperm and their egg should be able to get together, they probably won't get together. The machinery just won't be compatible. So let's talk about postzygotic barriers very briefly. Remember, this is once the sperm and the egg have already come together and a zygote has started to form. You would think that if a sperm and egg have come together and that zygote starts to form, well then that's a successful mating. But it's not exactly. A lot of times when two members of different species are able to make a zygote, we still have reduced hybrid viability and reduced hybrid fertility, and that's what's true in the case of things like the mule. Reduced hybrid viability means that if two species have a baby together, that baby isn't going to be strong or capable of living life very successfully. Reduced hybrid fertility in the case of the mule means that essentially that hybrid offspring is sterile. Mules can't make babies with other mules, horses, or donkeys. There's a reduction in the fertility of those offspring. There's also something called hybrid breakdown. Now again, this is when two distinct species are capable of having an offspring, but that offspring, when it has its own offspring, are actually weaker, more feeble, or sterile. So the hybrids themselves, that F1 generation, are vigorous and healthy, but the matings between the hybrids produce weak, feeble offspring. Okay, let's review the main takeaway messages from this lecture with a few questions. First, what is the defining feature of a species? It's a population whose members... Pause it if you don't have the answer yet, because I'll give you the answer. The answer is B, can reproduce and have fertile offspring. Members of distinct species end up having hybrid offspring that aren't very viable or no offspring at all. What kind of isolation prevents two different species from having viable fertile offspring? Geographic, morphological, evolutionary, or reproductive isolation? Pause it if you don't have the answer. The answer is D, reproductive isolation. Finally, two related but distinct species of finches mate and the female lays eggs. Which of the following is not a possible fate of the eggs? Read through these carefully and pause it so you have enough time, because I'm about to give away the answer. The answer is D, the egg will hatch and the newborn will be virile and healthy. The idea is that distinct species aren't able to have viable, healthy, fertile offspring. If these were members of the same species, they would easily be able to have that happen. But because I said in the question that they're two distinct species, answers A through C are much more likely. Okay, that's the end of our lecture, but we look forward to talking more about speciation and how speciation happens, how animals get reproductively isolated from each other in class.